On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines of the 1st Division landed on an obscure Pacific island called Guadalcanal. It marked the first American offensive of World War II. The campaign to secure the island lasted 6 months, and for much of its course, the balance teetered precariously from one side to the other. It included 6 major naval battles, daily aerial engagements, and countless clashes on land. No campaign in either theater saw such sustained action by sea, land, and air. The unpredictable forces of war began to link the United States with Guadalcanal in late May 1942, when advance echelons of the 1st Marine Division embarked for the South Pacific. Destination, New Zealand. Mission, undetermined. Somewhere on some unspecified battleground, sometime in the uncertain future, the untested Marines would clash with the tested soldiers of Japan. The ocean lifeline to the South Pacific was the war's longest and most tenuous. Stretching more than 6,500 miles from California to New Zealand, it tied Australia to the United States. If this supply line were broken, Australia and Asia would be forever Japanese. The advance echelon of the 1st Marine Division arrived at Wellington in mid-June. The Marines were to begin training for a future campaign in the Pacific and didn't expect to see any action for another 6 months. They were green, many of them fresh out of boot camp. Early in July, a lone American plane set in motion a chain of events that would bring American and Japanese forces together at a place that neither side had foreseen. On obscure Guadalcanal, air reconnaissance confirmed what radio intelligence had earlier discovered: the Japanese were building an airfield. What the plane had seen changed the course of the Pacific War. This discovery redirected Operation Watchtower from the Santa Cruz Islands to Guadalcanal and Tulagi, with the assault to take place on August 1st, less than 1 month away. The new target was prophetically codenamed Cactus. No one on either side could have predicted the grueling 6-month struggle that would ensue. Before dawn on August 7th, the amphibious task force separated into 2 groups as it approached Savo Island, one bound for Guadalcanal and the other Tulagi. The Japanese were not aware that the enemy was upon them. The first shells from the cruiser Quincy's turrets hurled America's reply to the nation that contrived Pearl Harbor. August 7th, 1942, the United States of America takes the offensive against the Empire of Japan.
Daylight, they started shelling the islands, Guadalcanal and Tulagi, and there were planes in the air bombing the area over there where they found the concentrations at, I guess.
6 and 8-inch naval guns spouted flame as thousands of tense Marines began to move slowly down the cargo nets suspended from the decks of the transports.
Had to climb down the rope landing nets down the side of the ship and try and time the surge of the Higgins boat with the roll of the ship so that when you stepped off the landing net, you hit the boat instead of falling in the water between the boat and the ship. And fortunately, I think most of us made it.
Well, it was pretty scary, I'll tell you. They loaded about 4 Higgins boats at a time, and they'd go out and they'd load the next 4, and they'd go out and circle, and they'd go out. When they got the Higgins boats all loaded, they spread out and all went in and hit the beach at the same time in different areas.
11,000 Marines would go ashore in the first amphibious assault by U.S. forces since 1898. The day of hit and run in the Pacific was over. The hour of hit and stay had come. The first Marines ashore in the campaign to capture the Solomons landed not on Guadalcanal, but on Tulagi. Just 2 miles long and half a mile wide, its proximity to nearby Florida Island made the capture of certain key features on Florida essential. A promontory on Florida overlooked the landing beach on Tulagi, and it was feared that Japanese artillery could wreak havoc on the amphibious force if this strategic point remained in Japanese hands. In addition to Tulagi, 2 small enemy-held islets, Gavutu and Tanambogo, were also to be seized. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines landed unopposed near the village of Halida on Florida Island. They quickly reached the desired promontory and successfully secured the flank. The landing at Tulagi went off as scheduled at 0800.
Where I landed at, we had to wade. We jumped over the side and had to wade waist deep into the island because it was coral. And I'll tell you, it was pretty rough with a pack on your back. And of course, I didn't have a gun. They didn't give us guns when we first went out there. But we had a pretty heavy pack on our back with our medical supplies. And Red Cross on your shoulder, which we got rid of. They were using them for targets. There wasn't much contact with the Japs until we got inland about 100 yards.
Upon reaching the shore, the 1st Raider Battalion and the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines began to make their way inland. The Raiders encountered Japanese resistance almost immediately. During the first day's action, the Raiders advanced toward the southeastern tip of Tulagi. At dusk, the units consolidated and dug in for the night.
That first night on Tulagi was indicative of what the Marines would face throughout the campaign in the Pacific. The Japanese launched 4 different counterattacks, which were all thrown back, but the ferocity of those attacks was really shocking to the Marines.
Over the next day and a half, the Raiders continued their push down the island. The cave complex and dug-in positions at the base of a deep man-made cut provided the most intense fighting on Tulagi. By the evening of August 9th, effective Japanese resistance on Tulagi had been eliminated. Gavutu and Tanambogo, connected by a causeway and each with prominent hills held by Japanese forces, were to be seized by 2 companies of the Marine 1st Parachute Battalion. The plan called for an amphibious assault to capture Gavutu before mounting an attack on Tanambogo over the causeway. Problems were immediately encountered when the assault boats were forced to divert from their intended landing area at a concrete seaplane ramp. Naval shelling prior to the invasion was so devastating that it had completely destroyed the original landing site. Forced to divert farther north, the Paramarines found themselves pinned down by fire from 3 sides. Casualties were taken, but gradually the Marines gained the upper hand. By 1800, the American flag flew over Gavutu, but above Tanambogo, a rising sun banner whipped defiantly. The following day, Tanambogo was inundated by a series of naval and aerial attacks. Tragically, bombs from Navy Dauntlesses fell short of their target, and several Marines on Gavutu were killed or wounded. Naval shelling proved more reliable, as first the destroyer San Juan and later Buchanan swept in to blast Japanese positions. At 1600, just minutes after Buchanan's devastating bombardment, the Marines landed on Tanambogo to little opposition. About 750 Japanese had died defending Tulagi and Gavutu Tanambogo, while 144 Americans were killed and nearly 200 wounded. The capture of the islands had not been costly as measured by the heartless business of war, yet it seemed so when compared with what faced the men scheduled to land on Guadalcanal. At 0910, landing craft carrying the 1st and 3rd Battalions, 5th Marines, jarred to a stop on Beach Red. Guadalcanal.
The landing itself, completely unopposed. There was nobody on the beach when we got there. We did hear some firing, and it was Seabees that had been on the beach for hours before we got there that were shooting coconuts out of trees. We were supposed to be scared, and we were, till we found out, hell, there was nothing there.
By necessity, Vandegrift's plan was not complex. The 5th Marines were to proceed along the coast to secure the flank, while the 1st Marines would move inland along the Tenaroo River and secure a grassy knoll identified as Mount Austin that lay a short distance from Beach Red.
The whole countryside there was either coconut groves or big high grass fields. Grass, well, some of it as high as your head. And it was just miserable going. And so we struggled along, pulling our communications carts and dragging everything. And I guess by the end of the day, we got back up, just starting back up into the hills. The password went out, and there was some shooting going on in the night, but it was mostly between guards that were set up on the perimeter and people that didn't know or had forgotten the password. I don't think anybody got hurt, but they very well could have.
August 8th began with a westward advance by all Marine forces on Guadalcanal. The 5th Marines continued toward Lunga Point, while the 1st Marines swung toward the Lunga River and approached the airfield from the south. Contact with small groups of Japanese began to occur as the Marines closed in on the airfield, but resistance was quickly overrun, and by 1600, the Marines had taken the airstrip.
The airstrip was essentially a wide spot in the road and was only marginally useful at the time that the Marines occupied that area, and was badly in need of improvement with pierced steel planking called Marston matting, or with gravel that could extend the useful length of the runway.
2 enemy camps and a large amount of equipment were also captured. Japanese trucks were put to use in hauling supplies from the beachhead, and the large caches of food, chiefly rice, would prove invaluable in the coming days. At 12:30 hours, a formation of 40 Japanese dive and torpedo bombers flew into a literal storm of steel thrown up by warships near Tulagi. Those that escaped the intense anti-aircraft fire were fallen upon by fighters from WASP. All but one of the 45 bombers that made the attack was shot down. Prior to the air raid, Japanese ships were spotted steaming toward Guadalcanal, but due to communications failures, the report failed to reach naval and marine commanders on the island. Under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the task force approached unchecked. By nightfall on August 8th, the beachhead extended a mile inland and 4 miles along the shore. The Marines owned the airstrip and nearly all the ground required to defend it. Vandegrift and his staff had reason to feel optimistic, but that feeling was not to last. Summoned aboard the Macaulay by Rear Admiral Richmond Turner, Vandegrift learned that Admiral Jack Fletcher's covering force, including all 3 aircraft carriers, had withdrawn due to fuel shortage and aircraft losses. Fletcher's departure left Turner with no choice. He would have to withdraw the amphibious task force, less than half unloaded, the following day, leaving behind only a small force of cruisers and destroyers. Due to the 3 entrances to the Sound, the Allied forces were compelled to divide into 3 patrolling squadrons: Southern, Northern, and Eastern. Behind the screen of warships, the transports lay off Lunga Point. Early on the morning of August 9th, Mikawa's force slipped unseen past the 2 destroyer pickets at the mouth of the Sound. The stage was set for the most humiliating defeat ever inflicted upon the U.S. Navy. Using standard Japanese tactics, Mikawa first launched torpedoes. 0145, a pair found the Australian ship Canberra. 6 and 8-inch gunfire followed, and Canberra was finished. Moments later, the heavy cruiser Chicago was hit. And while she managed to limp away, Chicago failed to report that an attack was underway. 15 minutes later, the Japanese fell upon the northern force, cruising sedately along in patrol formation. Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria were quickly gunned into sinking hulks and joined Canberra as the first layer of steel in what would become known as Iron Bottom Sound.
After Admiral Mikawa defeats the American Navy off Savo Island, the transports, who are unloading at Lunga Point, are completely defenseless. However, he elects at that point to withdraw because he is afraid of an American carrier strike with the first light. Now, obviously, if he had known that the American carriers had already withdrawn, he would have continued and destroyed the transports and leaving the Marines completely at the mercy of the Japanese Navy.
August 9th, Marines watched as Allied vessels picked up survivors and then slipped away through columns of smoke from the still burning remains of the American fleet.
People were washing up ashore. Some of them were swimming ashore. I don't know how many boats were sunk out there. I think I've read since then, but it was kind of a mess as far as our Navy was concerned.
In the Battle of Savo Island, 700 men were wounded and nearly 1,100 perished. For the American Navy, it was the worst disaster since Pearl Harbor. In just half an hour, the Japanese had changed the entire picture of an easy American victory at Guadalcanal. Virtually defenseless, the battered American Navy had no choice but to withdraw. When the last ships left, late on the 9th, General Vandegrift's Marines were all alone.
All the ships pulled out, and they weren't done unloading yet, but they just all bailed out on us, and by mid-afternoon they were all gone. So we did feel kind of halfway abandoned, and to be real honest, we didn't see any more American ships for a long time.
The Marines really were left on a shoestring, and they started calling the Guadalcanal operation not Operation Watchtower, but Operation Shoestring, because supplies were so much in demand.
The withdrawal of the transports had left the Marines with only part of their supplies, and now, with no air cover, it became imperative to get what supplies had come ashore off the beaches, where they were extremely vulnerable to attack. No air support would be available until the airfield was completed, and that task was made difficult by a lack of proper equipment, most of which sailed away before it could be unloaded. Forced to employ Japanese equipment to improve the runway, the engineers' task was further complicated by the unrivaled Japanese air superiority. Operating from bases in the northern and central Solomons, Japanese planes dominated the skies.
The problem at Guadalcanal was that the Japanese had the ability to come down and bomb it from both Bougainville and Rabaul.
The Japanese unleashed full fury from the sky. They went all out to destroy the airfield, planning to retake it later. 5 days after the landing, the airstrip was ready, and the Marines christened it Henderson Field to honor a fallen buddy. The field was designed and construction started by the Japanese, and it was completed with captured equipment, but the planes that would use it were American. General Vandegrift believed the Japanese were certain to take advantage of the Marines' predicament and launch an attack. Perimeter defenses were thus improved and patrols sent out to probe for the enemy. One such patrol, sent to investigate reports of Japanese landings east of the Marine perimeter, stumbled into a Japanese reconnaissance party, and in the ensuing firefight, 31 Japanese infantrymen were killed, leaving no doubt that Imperial Army troops were filtering ashore. Colonel Keono Ichiki's force of 900 men had landed at Taivu Point on August 19th in the first run of what the Marines came to call the Cactus Express. Later known as the Tokyo Express, these operations achieved the regularity of a crack railroad run. As defenses were being improved to guard against an attack from the east, the familiar sound of incoming aircraft signaled the Marines to start for their foxholes. However, these planes had come to land at Henderson Field, not to bomb it. The arrival of 12 Marine Dauntlesses and 19 Wildcats provided a tremendous boost for the men on the ground.
When Lieutenant Colonel Dick Mangrum and Major John L. Smith arrived with their SBDs and F-4Fs, it immediately gave a huge boost to morale among the Marine infantrymen on Guadalcanal, who had become accustomed to seeing only airplanes with rising suns painted on their wings. But now there were white-starred airplanes, and even though they arrived without much maintenance capability, at least they were able to start intercepting the Japanese daily bombing raids.
After we got some planes, that made all the difference in the world. Then from then on, they kept building up our Air Force, and it got to where it was a pretty respectable unit after a while.
Across the Tenaru, Ichiki was preparing his troops to retake the airfield. Early on the morning of August 21st, he gathered his men at the mouth of the river. Colonel Ichiki's force of 900 men was to be joined later by 1,500 more, but Ichiki had been given orders that permitted him to attack whenever he saw fit. Intelligence reports indicated that the American presence on the island was no greater than a raiding party cowering in a defensive perimeter around the airfield. With the element of surprise lost through the encounter east of the Tenaru, Ichiki decided to attack. At 0130, the Japanese charged across the Tenaru with bayonets fixed, and the Marines were ready for them.
We had one thing going for us. We had 37-millimeter guns with canister loads. A canister load is a load of essentially buckshot cast, I think, in beeswax. And there's an awful lot of shot there, and it spreads like a sawed-off shotgun. And we had 2 or 3 of those dug in covering that sand spit, plus machine guns and everything else. And it was just an absolute mess.
It was almost like a turkey shoot as the Japanese came across, and we're going to try to get across the river, almost at the mouth of the river where you could wade in the sand, but it was a slaughterhouse there.
Greatly outnumbered at the point of attack, the Japanese were cut down on the banks of the Tenaru. Only a few dazed bands survived, and at morning light, the Marines crossed the shallow river to carry the attack.
They moved the 2nd Battalion around behind them to trap them, and then they just started shelling the big Jesus out of the spot they were in. Some of them were trying to swim away, and it was a case of not so much can you get him, but who can get him first. And then they brought the tanks up, and the tanks moved out into this little peninsula sort of area where they were. And the tanks thrashed around out there, flushing them out. And they just were heaped up on the sand spit at the mouth of the river.
By dusk, nearly 800 Japanese, including Colonel Ichiki, were dead. Somehow only 44 Marines were lost. Henderson had been defended for the first time, and the planes, which had arrived the day before, were safe. As August drew to a close, events on Guadalcanal settled into routine monotony. Daily, the Japanese would stage air raids, but the long flight from Rabaul meant bomber formations could be expected between 11:30 and 14:30.
At certain times of the day, you didn't want to be around Henderson Field. I mean, it was heavy stuff. It'd shake the ground wherever you were at.
A curious tactical situation had developed at Guadalcanal as mastery of the seas was exchanged every 12 hours. The Americans ruled during daylight hours as ships unloaded and launches dashed around the Sound. Twilight signaled a quick Allied exodus and the arrival of the Tokyo Express. These troop carriers and their escorts would dash in to discharge soldiers or a freight, and while departing, they would toss a few shells in the Marines' direction.
I laid in the foxhole one night, and they was shooting at us with a pretty good-sized gun, and it was sizzling right over the top of our heads and through the coconut trees. And that's pretty scary, laying in a hole, not knowing where the next one's going to hit.
The last day of August brought more grief to the Marines on Cactus when the carrier Saratoga, on defensive patrol southeast of Guadalcanal, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Though she was later repaired, Saratoga was out of the fight for Guadalcanal. Vandegrift learned of her loss with a sinking heart, for intelligence reports indicated that the Tokyo Express had been landing troops and supplies with increasing regularity. Major General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi, commander of the 35th Infantry Regiment, had more than 5,000 troops near Taivu Point, more than twice the number of Marines believed to be on the island. While American manpower was grossly underestimated, Kawaguchi could expect to have overwhelming superiority at the point of attack, with the additional advantage of choosing when and where it would occur. Moreover, the Japanese would be facing defenders who were beginning to show the effects of little food and even less rest.
When food gets short, people start getting nasty, We knew we had no support because food stuff wasn't coming in. We were scrounging. We were finding Japanese rice sacks. They had big woven sacks that you'd find out in the brush. So we had that.
Hunger aside, day-to-day existence on Guadalcanal was difficult in the extreme.
The thing that people will always talk about regarding not just Henderson Field but Guadalcanal is that it was widely held it was the only place on earth where you could stand up to your knees in mud and still have dust blowing your eye.
Living conditions weren't too good. You slept on the ground. We didn't have tent camps or tents to live in. It was a case of shelter halves and whatever you can rustle up to keep the rain off. Fortunately, we were young and flexible and stupid. Didn't seem to bother us too much, but...
Subject to frequent shelling and constantly under the threat of air attack, the Marines were additionally harassed through a variety of Japanese tactics.
At night, they had, we called them Washing Machine Charlie. There's some kind of a little airplane that made funny noises, and he'd just come flying around, and it just kept everybody awake more than anything else. He never really did any serious damage. He'd always drop one bomb.
But these Japanese attempts to discourage the Marines were not without their lighter moments.
This damn Jap submarine would come every day without fail, and he'd just cruise up and down offshore and shoot at us. We had an old Marine Corps character. I think he was older than the hills even then. He'd been in Haiti and Nicaragua and God knows where, all China, named Lou Diamond. And he was the master mortarman of all mortarmen that ever were. And he took his mortar platoon down to the beach one day. And he set up that mortar, and damned if he didn't hit that submarine. A mortar is not going to hurt a submarine, but it sure made him submerge.
As September entered its second week, barge convoys to Kamimbo Bay had swelled the number of Japanese in the area to nearly 2,000. Under Colonel Oka, they were to coordinate with Kawaguchi's force to attack on September 12th. Planning to move by sea to an area near the Matanikau, inadequate shipping crippled the plan. The two Japanese units were 70 miles apart, with dense jungle and American Marines in between. Kawaguchi thus designated Oka's force the left wing and slated them to attack the southwest quarter of the Marine perimeter. The main assault would come from the south, led by Kawaguchi's 3 infantry battalions. The remnants of Ichiki's force, now designated the Kuma Battalion, would attack from the southeast. The Japanese advance began on September 9th, but soon bogged down. Unable to clear more than just a narrow path, the march through the jungle was torturous. Soaked in sweat or drenched by rain, the Japanese plodded on. Ever mindful of exposing their advance, open areas had to be avoided rather than sought. But however slowly, the Japanese were coming. Southwest of Henderson, a broken grassy ridge stretched 1,000 yards through the jungle to the banks of the Lunga River. When the Japanese attacked, Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Thomas and Colonel Edson were convinced it would be there. They presented their conclusions to Vandegrift, and on September 10th, Edson moved the raiders and paratroops to what he jokingly termed a rest area. By 1400, they were fortifying what his men referred to as Edson's Ridge. The Marines on Edson's Ridge drove themselves to complete their fortifications, a series of strong points with overlapping fields of fire. The terrain and denseness of the jungle, combined with the small number of men, precluded anything resembling a continuous line. To the rear, artillery batteries were registered to give Edson's men close support. The only available reserves, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, was moved into supporting positions. The Marine commanders were certain the enemy was coming that night. It was up to the raiders on the ridge to stop them. At the point of attack, 840 Marines would face over 2,000 Japanese. Below the ridge, Kawaguchi rushed to organize his men. The march through the jungle had scattered his detachments, and another day of preparation was in order. But he had assured Rabal that he would attack on the 12th. With no means of radio communication, Kawaguchi had no choice. He deployed his men along the Lunga, opposite the Marine right flank, and awaited the naval bombardment that was to precede his attack. 3 hours before midnight on September 12th, 20 minutes of bombardment from ships offshore signaled the beginning of the battle for Edson's Ridge. Machine gun and rifle fire broke out, and the Kawaguchi Brigade came pouring out of the jungle, probing for weak spots in the Marine line. They drove the raiders back and advanced down the Lunga to attempt an encirclement, but they lost their way once they left the riverbank, and mortar and artillery fire drove them back. On the left, the paratroops were struck. Holes were driven through their lines, but the Japanese failed to capitalize. At dawn, the Marines counterattacked, but there were not enough men to carry the fight.
After this first night on the Bloody Ridge, Colonel Edson will pull the Marines back 100 yards, which will allow him to tighten his perimeter. The defense will be much improved, fields of fire will be improved. The Japanese will have another 100 yards of open ground to attack across, and that gives him some more space to employ his artillery firepower on those attacking Japanese.
By the afternoon of the 13th, Marines on the ridge were sleepwalking after nearly 72 sleepless hours. They had expected to be relieved by Vandegrift's reserve, but air raids prevented this. Kawaguchi had been thwarted in his initial attempt when neither Colonel Oka in the west nor the Kuma Battalion in the east attacked as scheduled. As night began to fall, General Kawaguchi was certain a better coordinated effort would overwhelm the Americans. Edson's men had prepared a defensive line 1,800 yards long. Deployed in combat groups of approximately platoon strength, they were organized at about 100-yard intervals. At 1830, the first blows fell on the ridge as 2,000 Japanese sprinted toward the Marines in waves. They bent back the lines, but they could not break them. Even as the raiders were resisting the charge, shells began to drop on Henderson. To the east, the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, faced the Kuma Battalion.
We were spread out awful thin. It was just almost a one-man line. We did have double apron wire out, and it as good a defense as you could put together. But there was this field of high grass in front of us, and they had come through the grass. Again, they hit in the middle of the night. Why they picked the night to do all these things, I'm not sure. But they hit in the middle of the night, and everybody from headquarters company spent the rest of the night hauling ammunition up to the line because they were just using it like it was going out of style.
U.S. artillerymen rained shells down on the Kuma Battalion as they struggled through the barbed wire. Those who got through were met by machine gun fire. Back on the ridge, only about 300 Marines remained. Edson pulled them back to the spine of the ridge, only 1,500 yards from Henderson. But there they stayed while the Japanese suffered an onslaught of steel. Colonel Edson called in artillery fire, bringing it ever closer to his own lines. 105mm shells rained down on the Japanese. Throughout the long dawn of September 14th, the Battle of Edson's Ridge, known thereafter as Bloody Ridge, flickered and flared. At daybreak, P-400 spewed cannon fire into Kawaguchi's assembly points, while tanks drove back the remainder of the Kuma Battalion. The third prong of Kawaguchi's master plan, Colonel Oka's force, finally attacked the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines at daybreak. The attack was driven off with the help of an artillery barrage, as were several feeble attempts later that day. The men that remained from all 3 Japanese units were forced to withdraw into the jungle.
I think it was the morning after the battle we had on the Bloody Ridge episode thing. The cooks showed up with our usual ration of oatmeal, and you had to pick the worms and the weevils and the bugs out of it. Some of them walked out, but some of them you had to pick out with a fork. And powdered milk, and they brought that up for our breakfast, and the colonel just hit the ceiling. And he got on those cooks, and it's not really repeatable what he called them, but he said, "You get back there, and you be back here in 30 minutes with pancakes for these men." And by God, they were. Of course, they had weevils in them too, but at least they were cooked weevils.
The Marines achieved a significant victory in the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Had the Japanese succeeded in retaking Henderson Field, the Marines would have had a difficult time holding the island. The raiders and paratroops suffered 263 American casualties, with 59 killed or missing. Recorded losses in other units added another 38 killed and 18 wounded. Japanese losses were estimated at more than 700 killed and 500 wounded. Kawaguchi's failure shocked the Japanese command, and by September 19th, a plan to retake Guadalcanal had been fashioned. The Army's presence on the island was to be significantly upgraded, while the Navy and its air wing would attempt to halt U.S. supply operations. The Americans also issued a revised plan, establishing for the first time a complete perimeter defense. Japanese tendencies played strongly in its design, most notably their disregard for the effectiveness of massed firepower. During the first 3 weeks of October, the Tokyo Express was able to swell the Japanese presence on the island to approximately 14,000. Among the freshly landed troops was the elite Sendai 4th Infantry Division.
The Japanese Army and the Navy, in a rare display of serious inter-service cooperation instead of rivalry, mounted a multi-phased attack on Guadalcanal. This was a genuinely serious effort to throw the Americans off the island and end the Allied threat to their southern flank.
The Japanese scheme provided for attacks on the American perimeter at 3 points. General Sumiyoshi was to distract American attention to the coastal corridor, while General Maruyama led the Sendai Division, 7,000 men, on a jungle march to attack from the south. An amphibious assault at Coley Point was to provide the coup de grace. The attack was to commence on October 22nd, but the jungle stymied the movement of Maruyama's force. With no equipment to clear the way, the Sendai was forced to hack its way through. With each man carrying ammunition, an artillery shell, and some rations, the column inched along the trail. Disassembled artillery pieces lagged farther and farther behind. Maruyama considered his difficulties and postponed the attack 24 hours. The next day, he pushed the date back to the 24th.
The American commanders have a captured Japanese map that details the three-pronged attack, but other than that, they have really no hard intelligence. Their ground and aerial patrols have turned up no Japanese activity except on the Matanikau. And so it seems logical to the commanders that the map may be a ruse, and that they begin then to focus all their efforts at the Matanikau, and the Japanese do everything they can to draw American attention to that front.
Omens for an attack along the coast were offered up in the form of increased artillery fire directed mainly at Henderson. Infantry-supported tanks were sent out, and finally, shelling was redirected toward the east bank of the Matanikau. Had communications between Japanese units not broken down, the feint may have worked to perfection. However, General Sumiyoshi was unaware of Maruyama's second postponement, and on the evening of the 23rd, his forces attacked. Elements of the 4th Infantry, accompanied by tanks, struck at the Americans, but 10 Marine artillery battalions had registered their guns on the mouth of the Matanikau and the coastal track behind it. Over 6,000 rounds crushed the infantry attack, and anti-tank weapons destroyed most of the advancing tanks. The Japanese suffered heavy casualties and scarcely made a scratch in the Marine line. The attack confirmed the belief that the major assault would come from the west, and Colonel Hannikin's battalion was pulled out of the line south of the airfield and redeployed, leaving Chesty Puller's battalion to defend a 2,500-yard front. By October 24th, Maruyama's force had reached its assembly area south of Henderson. Exhausted by their 6-day trek, they prepared to mount an attack supported by little more than unyielding devotion to their emperor. Artillery pieces and mortars had been mostly abandoned, making machine guns their most formidable weapons. As the Japanese began working their way toward final jump-off points, the jungle continued to wreak havoc on their assault plan. Units lost their way or became separated, and when the attack was finally launched, it came off piecemeal and lacked coordination. The Sendai lurched toward the Americans, with the leading elements reaching the Marine line about 2,200. Skirmishes began to flare up along the perimeter, and by 0130, Puller recognized that a major attack was in progress. Puller requested reinforcement, and the 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry, was sent to link up with the Marines. The situation dictated that the soldiers be intermingled with Marines along the front lines, and together they successfully halted the Japanese attack. During the night, a small salient was established in the center of Puller's line, but the toehold was quickly eradicated. An erroneous report to Tokyo suggested that the Marines were teetering on the edge of defeat, and Fleet Headquarters believed a naval bombardment might push them over. Japanese naval and air units were dispatched to Guadalcanal to provide the blow and also to cover the amphibious landing at Coley Point.
And they were bombing along the runway, and by the time it was over, they ran out of bombs, fortunately, quarter of a mile from us, but By the time it was over, I was just shaking so bad that one of the guys gave me a cigarette, and it really calmed my nerves down, and I've been smoking the damn things ever since. So someday I'm going to sue the Marine Corps for starting me smoking.
Although most Americans spent the day below ground on Dugout Sunday, the Cactus Air Force met the Japanese with a vengeance. Wildcats continuously roared off, engaged flights of Zeros and bombers, landed, rearmed, refueled, and took off again, and in the process claimed 12 enemy planes. SBDs engaged the surface fleet, sinking one light cruiser and damaging 2 destroyers.
My respect for the real heroes of those early days in the Solomon Islands were the flyers. Those guys would come back, and every day some of them didn't come back. And the guy would get out of bed the next morning and get back and go and do it again. And I don't think the people of the United States don't understand what that group of people did. Every day they got up and went back.
While air and naval forces held center stage, ground commanders on both sides reassessed the situation. Puller and Hall's battalions were separated and redeployed, with the Division Reserve stationed just behind them. Counting on better coordination, the Japanese battle plan was virtually unchanged.
The Japanese were so confident that it was going to work that they launched a major fighter sweep from Rabaul, which was to orbit Henderson Field and wait for a prearranged signal from the Japanese army on the ground saying that it was all right to come on down and land.
That night, Maruyama's 16th and 29th Infantry Regiments again attacked the southern perimeter. Without artillery preparation or knowledge of the enemy's position, placing faith in spiritual power over firepower, the Sendai rushed to their destruction.
Defense set up with crossfires arranged, that whole works. And the guys back in the trees would holler and say they're coming through the wire at such and such a spot. So they would set their machine guns and everything to saturate that particular entry through the wire. And there was a lot of Japanese killed there.
At 0300, Colonel Oka's forces attacked Hannikin's battalion on a ridge east of the Matanikau. The Marines on the left were forced to fall back, but before the Japanese could consolidate their position, a hastily collected group that included runners and cooks launched a counterattack, and after a short, vicious fight, Oka's men were forced to withdraw. The Japanese land offensive of late October failed for many reasons, not the least of which was the skill and determination with which the Americans fought. Equally accountable, though, was the Japanese command's tactical inflexibility. Rather than drawing from the failures of Ichiki and Kawaguchi, they arrogantly went forward with a plan that broke down for many of the same reasons. That Vandegrift and his staff benefited from Japanese inflexibility is undeniable, but it does not diminish the brilliance with which they met this most critical phase of the campaign.
The climax of the Guadalcanal campaign occurred in the middle of November, with the last major effort on the part of the Japanese to reinforce their garrison on the island. By that point, the Japanese saw the way the campaign was going, and the large majority of the troops who were still on the island were in no condition to carry on. They were disease-ridden. Hundreds and thousands of them eventually starved to death. So reinforcement was absolutely vital if the Japanese were to retrieve the situation.
On the eve of this massive Japanese effort, Admiral Turner ran 2 separate groups of transports to Guadalcanal. Turner dispatched Rear Admiral Norman Scott to accompany one group and Admiral Daniel Callahan to escort the other. Early light on November 12th revealed the transports and their escort lying safely off Lunga Point. 5,500 replacements came ashore, among them the 182nd Infantry Division. Rabal soon learned of the transport's presence, and at 1400, 16 torpedo-armed bombers materialized over Guadalcanal. The entire attack lasted 8 minutes, but 16 planes fell, including 4 American and 1 pilot. These losses were made up later that day when the first P-38s arrived, giving the Cactus Air Force 77 operational planes.
The thing that most people don't realize about operating from Henderson Field in those months of 1942 is how close run a thing it was. There were a couple of occasions where only one SBD was airworthy on the entire island. There were times when you had 3 or 4 times as many pilots as available airplanes. It was a meat grinder, and the case has been made that despite all the battles that came before and after Guadalcanal, that campaign was the one which really defined the way the war was going to go, because it involved the type of attrition warfare that a small island nation such as Japan simply could not hope to win.
The enemy task force was sighted steaming toward Guadalcanal prior to noon on the 12th, and Turner surmised that the Japanese intended to either attack his transports as they withdrew or bombard Henderson. To his credit, Turner continued unloading operations until late in the day, then withdrew with only a nominal screen, leaving 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers behind to engage the Japanese. Admiral Callahan, whom Turner left in command, was faced with an urgent situation, but he had neither the experience nor the training for the mission he had received. After seeing the transport safely away, he organized his ships into a line-ahead formation and awaited the Japanese. Early on the 13th, the Japanese bombardment force entered Iron Bottom Sound, built around battleships Hai and Kirishima. Confident that there were no American warships present, hundreds of bombardment projectiles were stacked around the 14-inch turrets. Callahan's task force approached the Japanese at 20 knots on nearly a reciprocal course. Well aft of the van destroyers, cruiser Helena's effective SG radar first detected the enemy at 0124 at a range of 27,000 yards. This picture was not clear to Callahan, whose choice of flagship denied him the use of SG radar. At 0141, the leading Japanese and American destroyers sighted each other, and within minutes the entire Japanese force knew of the contact. Confusion reigned as the range between the leading elements decreased to a ludicrous 1,000 yards. Whether by fate or through tactical blunders, Callahan had brought on a point-blank brawl of monstrous proportions. At 0148, 24 minutes after Helena positively identified enemy ships closing the range, Callahan issued the order, "Stand by to open fire." Ships opened fire from all directions, and the battle soon degenerated into individual ship-to-ship actions. In the confusion, both sides fired on their own ships.
There must have been, I don't know, 15 or 20 ships out there firing at each other. And then I saw this cruiser, light cruiser, blow up. They must have hit their magazines below that turret. The column of fire went up like this, huge column, and in it I could see this turret just turning over and over, going up.
On shore, the men gathered to watch this awesome melee.
One of them would fire a broadside and it looked like a flock of quail taking off. And then a ship would blow up and light up the whole sky, and it was just a fearsome battle. And the next morning, I think it was the Atlanta, was just not too far offshore, and it looked just fine until you look through binoculars. There's just holes all along the side, and the whole bridge was just blown off, just as clean as if it had been cut off with a cutting torch. And the San Francisco, the heavy cruiser, was out over toward Savo, dead in the water. And if you got glasses, the whole fantail for maybe 50, 75 feet was just blown off clear down to the waterline. And I think that was Admiral Callahan that was on the bridge that was killed there. But there was also a Japanese battleship out on the horizon that was smoking up a storm, and the planes were just back and forth, the dive bombers particularly.
The Americans on Guadalcanal were treated to a sight they had never seen or perhaps even imagined. There was a huge Japanese battleship, the Hai, steaming slowly in circles. She had been badly damaged during the surface engagement during the night, and this was simply the Big Rock Candy Mountain to the Marines who had been on the receiving end of so much horrific naval bombardment over the previous few months. And the Enterprise, being the only carrier still in the area, sent a succession of shuttle missions where dive bombers and torpedo planes would attack Hawaii, land ashore at Henderson Field, rearm, refuel, go back out again, perhaps with their same squadron mates, perhaps with people they had never seen before. And throughout the length of the day, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps air crews gradually wore down that battleship, and she became the first battleship ever sunk by air power by the United States Navy. And as such, it was a significant achievement.
When the battle was over, Admirals Callahan and Scott were dead, as were more than 750 American sailors. Of the 13 American ships involved, only one escaped damage. Barton blew up, Monson sank, Cushing and Laffey were lost, as were the cruisers Atlanta and Juno. The latter finished off by a Japanese submarine as she tried to stagger home after battle, carrying another 700 men to the bottom. Among them were 5 brothers, the Sullivans, who had insisted on serving together despite opposition from their superiors. The loss of Juno and her crew brought total American losses in the aftermath of the naval battle of Guadalcanal to more than 1,400. Halsey sensed that the Japanese had been only temporarily deflected, and he ordered Admiral Kincaid on Enterprise to detach a segment of his covering force to prevent further Japanese incursions. Under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee, the battleships South Dakota and Washington and a screen of 4 destroyers sailed immediately for Iron Bottom Sound.
We got word from Cactus Control that there were 75 Jap warships and 3 different task forces coming down. And we looked up, and here was a row of warships on the horizon coming in. And so our skipper called, I was right next to him, I could hear him. He called Cactus Control and says, we have targets, we have ships coming in. He gave their course and their speed, and we were going to attack. And then another voice came on the radio and said, this is Ching Chong Lee. You get your PT boats out of here, I have you on my radar.
By nightfall on November 14th, Admiral Nobutake Kondo was approaching Guadalcanal. His force of 14 warships was built around the battleship Kirishima. As early as 2200, keen-eyed Japanese lookouts had detected the distant silhouettes of hostile ships, but the disposition of this force was uncertain and was believed to consist of destroyers and new-type cruisers, a notion that was soon to be disproved.
These ships went around behind Savo, and then another group came on behind them. So our skipper called in, he could see them, and he called in and asked Admiral Lee, he says, you have, he gave a course and speed to the ships he saw and said, you have friends behind you. And Admiral Lee came back on the radio and says, I have no friends. And about then, all hell broke loose.
As usual, the Japanese began by firing their deadly long-lance torpedoes, and as usual, they hit their targets. Steelfish sunk the destroyers Walk and Preston and crippled Benham in the opening moments. Only Gwynn escaped the torpedo attack, but gunfire soon drove her from the battle. 2 miles to the rear of the American destroyers, South Dakota was repeatedly losing power due to faulty electrical equipment. Taken under fire by the Japanese, she could reply only with 5-inch gunfire. Her superstructure was riddled and her radar disabled, but her watertight integrity was never compromised. While South Dakota drew the bulk of the attention, Washington approached to within 8,500 yards of the Japanese undetected. Taking Hiroshima under fire, she quickly buried the battleship under an avalanche of fire, scoring 9 16-inch direct hits and more than 35 5-inch hits. While South Dakota retired, Washington proceeded to sink Ayanami and then began to gradually disengage from the action. The bombardment fleet had once again been turned back. For the Japanese, their defeat in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal ended any hope of wresting the island from the Americans. In the course of 3 days' heavy fighting in and around the area, they had lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, 11 combat transports, and the majority of the men and supplies they were to deliver. In spite of heavy losses, the United States had gained the upper hand in the campaign, and the victory signaled the beginning of the end for the Japanese in the Solomons. Control of the sea and air had passed to the United States. Although the campaign for Guadalcanal was far from over for the 1st Marine Division, December brought with it a long-awaited event. After nearly 4 months of intermittent combat, air raids, and naval attacks, the worn-out division was to be relieved, with the first echelon leaving in early December. The U.S. Army Americal Division's 132nd Infantry arrived at Lunga on December 8th, and the next day, Vandegrift turned over command of American forces on Guadalcanal to Major General Alexander Patch.
When they finally took us off, we had been occupying the position on the Matanikau for quite some time. And I think we were down to 40% or less effective, just from malaria and jungle rot and dysentery and you name it, we had it. But the thing that really was kind of pitiful was seeing those guys trying to climb those cargo nets and get back on the ship, because they just weren't in shape that they could climb them. And so the sailors were coming down the nets and helping, and eventually we got everybody on the ship, but it was a struggle, and it was kind of sad because it was a good group.
An epitaph on the grave of one who remained perhaps best sums up the battle that was Guadalcanal. And when he goes to heaven, to St. Peter he will tell, "Another Marine reporting, sir. I've served my time in hell."